Facebook, here we go. Just 1 second for that to get started. Okay, well, we have a big crowd tonight. It's great to see. Lots of interest in history. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's about 6:01. Okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the next in our series of virtual events under one fence, the land and legacy of the Waggoner Ranch, or Waggoner. We were just talking about that. These virtual events were started at the beginning of the pandemic, but have become part of the regular programming offered by the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. As always, our hope is that through these events, you will continue to get to know us and learn more about our mission to support the Texas Historical Commission in its preservation efforts across the state. Many of you have chosen to support us with donations, for which we are so grateful. Thank you. I want to welcome our THC commissioners, friends, board members, and advisors, as well as some of our colleagues at the Texas Historical Commission who are with us today. Thank you all for taking time to join us. I'm Christy Peliquin, the Development Manager for the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. If you haven't already followed us on social media, please do. We would love to connect with you. This is also one way you can find out about future events like our next virtual event, Settlement and Survival Along the Lower Rio Grande, which is scheduled for October 6th at 6 p.m. This event will feature Margaret McAllen, Director of Humanities at the Witte Museum in San Antonio. Registration is already open at thcfriends.org. We hope you will be able to join us for that fascinating session. Before I get started tonight, we just have a few housekeeping items. We would appreciate it if you could keep your microphones on mute. I think we've all learned how to be good virtual event attendees by now, but keeping your microphone on mute helps us stay focused on our presenters. So we would sure appreciate your help with that. And let's see, we will also have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So while the presentation is going on, if you want to go ahead and put questions into the chat box, we will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. We'll typically run to about 7:30. It depends on how many questions we have, but we will try to cut things off at 7:30. And when we get to your question, I may ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question directly if you're comfortable with that. And if not, I'll be happy to ask it for you. We are also broadcasting this event through Facebook Live. And so after the presentation, we will email you a link to the recording and you can share that with your friends and family if you'd like to. And one additional note before we get rolling with the presentation, I will at some point post some resources that our presenters have put together for us into the chat box. It's going to be links to the Red River Valley Museum, as well as some books, links to some reading recommendations and other things. So watch for that in the chat box. Okay, it is now my privilege to introduce our presenter for today. As you may know, the Friends of the THC's motto is preserving the real places and real stories of Texas. Our presenter tonight will introduce us to a true Texas legend, the Waggoner Ranch. Jeff Bearden is here with us tonight, joined by Cooper Alexander, who is the Marketing and Programming Director of the Red River Valley Museum. She's off camera, but she's going to be helping Jeff tonight. Jeff is the former director of forensic psychiatric programs at North Texas State Hospital in his hometown of Vernon, where he served as mayor for 6 years. He holds a BA in history from Texas A&M and an MSSW from the University of Texas at Arlington. In addition to presenting papers in his mental health profession, he has been a presenter and panelist in Texas history at the Alamo Society, the West Texas Historical Association, and the National Cowboy Symposium. Jeff turned his interest into a home-based business called Texas Back Then, through which he performs chuck wagon demonstrations and living history programs. His chuck wagon team competes in cook-offs, and they even had a replica stagecoach for a few years. I would have loved to see that. For 30 years, Jeff also portrayed David Crockett in living history programs at the Alamo, other historical sites, school programs, and documentaries for the History Channels and Discovery Channel. Jeff has served as co-chair of the Vernon Rotary Club's Marking the Great Western Trail project. He's also served as a member of the Red River Valley Museum Board, chair of the Will Barger County Historical County Historical Commission, and past president of the Great Western Cattle Trail Association. He's the current president of the Santa Rosa Palomino Club Precision Riding Group, the Ambassadors on Horseback for the state of Texas. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your experience and stories and expertise and just your Texas spirit. I'm so excited that you could be here with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Christy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I want to add my thanks for Cooper's assistance in pulling together the pictures, the slides that we have here. And I want to welcome everybody to the Red River Valley Museum here in Vernon, and give our thanks to the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission for allowing us to be what I understand is the first museum to do a program like this. The museum is located on the campus of Vernon College, Highway 70 in Vernon. The museum started in a cloakroom in the Will Barger Auditorium with the donation of a very outstanding artifact and fossil collection for Mr. and Ms. J. Henry Ray. In 1976, the museum moved to an old hospital building as part of the bicentennial celebration, and in the early 80s was moved into the building that you see on the screen after a donation from William A. Bond and a fundraiser that was held out at the Waggoner Ranch. The museum has three major rooms. The Berry Gallery includes the history of the area from prehistoric times up through the Great Western Cattle Trail and some of the modern businesses in Vernon. The Bond Gallery is where these animal trophies are printed and presented in an educational manner. We have a traveling exhibit room with art shows and a variety of shows, and the Waggoner Gallery that tells the story of the W.T. Waggoner Estate and the Waggoner Ranch. Our Waggoner Gallery is filled with artifacts from the ranch, from the family, that reflects their interest in agriculture and horses, their contributions to Vernon through the rodeo, artifacts like family saddles. There is a replica of Mrs. Biggs's sculpture, and well, her sculpture is here, and a replica of her studio that was out at the Waggoner Ranch. We invite you to come and see this and all of our galleries, and join us as we plan the upgrade to this room that's going to take place very soon.
This looks incredible, Jeff. This is the museum?
That's the museum. Ready? The story of the Waggoner Ranch is a story as big as Texas itself. The ranch is the largest ranch under one fence at over 510,000 acres and has been described as the second largest ranch in the world. Vernon is the home of the Waggoner Ranch, and the museum is proud to host the Waggoner Room that tells the story. So let's look at the history of the Waggoner Ranch and the Waggoner family from the beginning. The story of the Waggoner Ranch begins with Dan Waggoner. He was born in 1828 in Tennessee and moved with his family to Hopkins County Texas when he was about 20 years old. Not long after they moved to Texas, his father died. His father had been a successful farmer and cattleman, but when Dan started out on his own, he had about 14 cows, I believe 12 sheep, a rifle, 21.5 acres, and $3.48 in cash. He married Nancy Moore, and they had a son, William Thomas Waggoner. He was born in 1852, and then Nancy died the following year. In 1854, Dan purchased a herd of longhorn cattle, and together with his son, they moved to a small farm on Catlett Creek in what is now Wise County. During that time, Dan had begun to accumulate cattle up to the start of the war between the states. Now, Dan didn't go east to fight in the war. He stayed to defend the frontier from marauding Kiowa and Comanche Indians and continued to produce beef for the war effort. By about the 1860s, Dan owned about 15,000 acres of land and quite a few head of cattle. He continued to purchase land and cattle, traveling farther from his home in what is now Wise County. He would carry gold and in his saddlebags and traveled in ever widening circles around Wise County to buy cattle. And he had to divide his time equally between developing the cattle enterprise and at the same time protecting it from Kiowa Comanches, who certainly resented being pushed off of their lands. The raids in that area were frequent, and W.T. recounted the story throughout his life to his family of, as a youngster, he and Dan's second wife, Cecilia, had to flee their cabin and go hide in a cornfield from an Indian raid. They knew it was getting serious when they heard the sounds of their animals being killed, and when they came out the next morning, found that their dog and a horse had been killed, and so Dan decided to move the family into Decatur. After they'd moved to Decatur and as their prosperity grew, Dan built a fine home in that town that was still on the frontier. The home was named El Castile, and it was certainly elegant in its day. W.T. remodeled it in 1931, but in honor of his dad, he left the brass nameplate on the front door that said Daniel Waggoner. And they came back to it and kept it as a summer retreat and a home for some time. It's in other hands at this point. By 1866, their herds were growing, and they began to brand their cattle with a backwards D brand. And this is the picture you see on the screen there is the iconic 3D brand in a circle that's the trademark of the ranch today. There's several different stories about the origins of the 3D brand. One was that a blacksmith just made the branding iron the wrong way, where it branded it backwards. Another is that they had started branding with a mule shoe, and at one point some of Waggoner's property was called the Mule Shoe Ranch, and they went ahead and moved over from the mule shoe as a brand to a branding iron. The most prominent story is that the 3D brand in the circle was hard to rework. It was hard for the rustlers to run with a running iron, and so they branded with the 3Ds up until the point that cattle hides got to be, and to preserve the hides and make them more valuable for resale, they branded with one reverse D, which is the practice today. But as I said, it's still a trademark of the ranch. William Thomas, or W.T., or Tom, as he was known, was the son of Nancy Moore and Dan Waggoner. He was born in Hopkins County on the family farm in August of 1852. A year later, his mother died, and his father left him in the care of his sister. Later on, Daniel married Cicely Halsell in 1859 and established a ranch at the Cactus Hill headquarters on the West Fork of the Trinity River in Wise County. And Cicely Ann adopted W.T. or Tom as his own. He, as I said earlier, never forgot that story of he and Cicely having to hide in the cornfield from the Indians, but he wanted to follow in his footsteps to run the best cow outfit in the country. And by 1869, he had become his father's partner in the cattle business. By 1870, he was working closely with Dan and learning from the cattle business from Dan. And Dan was apparently a pretty good teacher. In addition to being good business partners, Dan and Tom were especially close as father and son. In around 1869 or so, Dan had received an offer from another man to buy out his properties and sell out his cattle interests and everything. And Tom talked him out of it. He asked that his dad continue the partnership. And so they formed Dan Waggoner and Son as the name for the cattle enterprise that they had. In 1870, Dan asked Tom to drive a herd of longhorn cattle to Abilene, Kansas. The cattle industry was about all we had in Texas after the Civil War. Texas was in an economic depression, and cattle that were worth $2 a head in Texas were worth $40 or $50 a head at the railheads in Kansas if the cattlemen could get their cattle up there. So the great cattle drives were born, going up the Abilene Trail. It was later known as the Chisholm Trail. And Dan gave Tom $12 and 10 drovers to take a herd to Abilene. And he did. He successfully got the herd up there. Dan told him to be careful as he followed other herds. And if he picked up a few strays from herds that were ahead of him along the way, that'd be okay too. So when Tom got to Abilene, he sold the cattle for $55,000, and that provided the money to really start the growth of the Waggoner Ranch and the Waggoner cattle enterprises. Dan and Tom did get a little crossways about one point. Tom, thinking it'd be prudent, put the money in the bank when he collected the money for the sale of the cattle. And when Dan heard about that, he got all over him because he didn't trust banks. He thought they were subject to failure. It's interesting, later on, a number of members of the family were in the banking business, but Dan didn't trust him at the time, and he told him to get a cardboard suitcase, put the money in it, and bring it home. Dan loved, as the railroad moved to Decatur and Decatur grew, Dan and some of the, W.T. Waggoner and some of the other men loved to meet at the train station, sort of an early day version of businessmen going to coffee at the coffee shop. They would meet there and visit, whittle, check cattle prices. One day a man got off the train there in Decatur, looked over at him and asked if somebody could carry his luggage to the hotel. Tom Waggoner got up, folded up his pocket knife, and picked up the suitcases and started carrying them to the hotel. As they were passing El Castillo, the beautiful house on the hill, the man asked Tom, said, "Who lives in that house?" And Tom Waggoner said, "Well, I do." And he said, "Well, how in the world does a man like you be able to afford to live in a house like that?" Tom told him, "It's because I learned to carry my own damn suitcase a long time ago." W.T. Waggoner would never ask a man to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. Waggoners were restless, and they kept moving further west to land south of the Red River and north of present-day Electra, Texas. They were able to expand their cattle operations by leasing land in the Indian Territory in the Big Pasture. W.T. Waggoner, Burt Burnett, Slaughter, and other big cattlemen worked out a mutually profitable arrangement with Quanah Parker of the Comanche Nation to graze the Big Pasture in what's now Oklahoma. As access to the Big Pasture was coming to an end, Waggoners later sold land near the Red River they had in a tract that was known as the Waggoner Colony, and purchased land on Beaver Creek in Wilbarger County. They were able to buy land for $5 an acre to assemble the ranch as it is today. Somebody once asked Tom if he wanted to buy all the land in Texas, and he said, "No, I don't want all of it, just I want to buy the land that adjoins me." We'll talk a little more about the Big Pasture in a few minutes. Their new ranch holdings in Wilbarger County were no stranger to the cattle industry. The Great Western Cattle Trail and its cattle drives from Dodge City to Dodge City to Ogallala and points further north passed through or near what is now the ranch and left Texas at Doan's Store in northern Wilbarger County on the Red River. So Tom had learned those lessons of managing cattle and land very well from his father, and he was devastated in 1902 when his father, Dan Waggoner, died. At the time Dan died, he owned approximately 80,000 head of cattle, 525,000 acres of land, and had a lease on more than 100,000 acres in the Oklahoma Territory. Okay. As I mentioned, W.T. Waggoner wasn't alone in the need for grazing in the early 1900s. The ranchers in Texas, including W.T. Waggoner and Samuel Burke Burnett, the owner of the 4 Sixes Ranch, turned to the Indian Territory for more grass. They struck a deal with Quanah Parker to graze the Indian lands known as the Big Pasture across the Red River from Wilbarger and Wichita counties. Quanah was the last war chief of the Comanches and had led his people to reservation life and proved to be an adept businessman and an able leader of his people in making the transition from the warlike life to life on the reservations. The grazing arrangements and between the Comanches and the Texas ranchers looked like they were going to become an issue as Oklahoma was moving towards statehood. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt came to the area, presumably to go on a wolf hunt with W.T. Waggoner, Burke Burnett, Quanah Parker, and others in the Big Pasture. They had a fine time hunting wolves, a lot of which were actually coyotes. They had a man along with them named Jack Abernathy, who's called Bring 'em Back Alive, who had learned how to catch wolves or coyotes alive with his bare hands. And so he demonstrated that. And they were accompanied by Texas Ranger Bill McDonald of One Ranger fame as their bodyguard. And the president and Burke Burnett, W.T. Waggoner, and all of them, while on the wolf hunt, sorted out the issues with the Big Pasture. And they concluded their trip there with a horse race between the president, Tom Waggoner, Burke Burnett, and others from their camp into Frederick, Oklahoma. So these fellows were an old time breed that I don't think we'll see anymore. Some have called them a vanishing breed. They may be a vanished breed. People like Tom Waggoner, Burke Burnett, Quanah Parker, Theodore Roosevelt, Bill McDonald, and later on Will Rogers and Amon Carter, men that were born in the 19th century, saw the changes of the West from wide open spaces where they were having to do battle with Indians who later became their friends and business partners into the 20th century. They formed special bonds, special friendships, but they weren't above trying to get into each other's pockets. Popular story in the Waggoner family is about when Burke Burnett and W.T. Waggoner had one of a number of wagers. Burke Burnett bet Tom Waggoner that he couldn't say the Lord's Prayer. Well, Tom said, I'll take that bet. And so Burke Burnett said, all right, go ahead and recite it. So Tom Waggoner started off, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Burke Burnett said, okay, Tom, okay, you win. I'll pay it off. Yeah.
That's not the Lord's Prayer.
What?
Not the Lord's Prayer.
No, it's not the Lord's Prayer. That's the point of the story. By 1909, Tom Waggoner was able to give each of his 3 children 90,000 acres of land and 10,000 head of cattle apiece. He had each of his children draw for part of the Waggoner Ranch and gave it to them for a Christmas present. Each gift was worth about $6 million. Electra drew the Double Heart Ranch, son Guy, the Four Corners Ranch, and E. Paul Waggoner, the Zacawista Ranch. Electra, the daughter, was the apple of her father's eye, and she wanted the Zacawista Ranch that was closer to her father, and he wanted her to have it, so he arranged a trade between E. Paul and Electra so that Electra could get the Zacawista Ranch. One of the issues on the ranch for years has been the lack of water. There is no accessible groundwater to speak of on the ranch. Most of it is surface water that's captured in tanks or creeks or rivers or draws. That didn't stop Tom Waggoner from trying to find water. And in 1911, in one of their attempts to drill for water, they struck oil. Waggoner thought about it was the only thing it was good for was a tick dip for his cattle, and didn't care for it. But by 1911, the oil fields had been developed. The town of Electra, which has been named for WT's daughter Electra, overnight became one of the Texas boom towns. And not long after that, the Waggoner Oil Company, with their own gas stations and refinery, were organized, and certainly expanded the Waggoner family wealth. Will Rogers visiting the ranch once remarked, said, "Well, Tom, I see you've got an oil well for every cow out there." About 1904, Tom moved the family to Fort Worth and later built a major office building and served as a bank director. He divided his time between the ranch headquarters in Wilbarger County and Fort Worth. At about the same time, he bought a 3,000-acre farm near Arlington, Texas, between Dallas and Fort Worth. The Waggoner herd began, like most herds in Texas, with the Texas Longhorns. Wild cattle had roamed the plains during and after the war between the states, and cow hunting became an industry, and collecting those cattle, and then later cow trailing to get them to the markets up the cattle trails to the railheads, and formed the start of the cattle industry in Texas. It really secured Texas' future because after the war between the states, the agrarian cotton economy was devastated, and the $2 cattle were all that Texas had, that, as I said earlier, were worth $40 or $50 at the railhead. Between 1885 and 1895, Waggoner purchased and introduced Durham and Hereford cattle into the herd, and so by the early 20th century, the herd was mostly Hereford, using ranch-raised bulls and purchased bulls to improve the bloodlines. And Hereford was the predominant breed of cattle up through the mid to late 20th century, when the crossbred cattle were introduced by E. Paul Waggoner's son-in-law, John Biggs, to improve the quality of the meat product. With the profits from the oil and the cattle and wealth, Tom decided that he would consolidate the ranch enterprise. After he'd given the land to his 3 children, he decided he would take it back, and he organized the entire operation into the W.T. Waggoner estate. This provided for more financial and administrative security for the ranch. It leveled the playing field among the children because the oil income and oil wealth wasn't equally distributed across the property. And WT was also concerned about the fact that his children had engaged in a number of marriages, and they were engaging in an awful lot of spending, and he wanted to protect the future of the ranch. So it was all consolidated into one. This is a diagram of the Waggoner Ranch, and it remains pretty much as it's shown on this map today. It runs 30 miles from east to west, 25 miles from north to south, and while much of it's in Wilbarger and Baylor counties, the ranch touches 6 counties in North Texas. The ranch includes 3 lakes that include Lake Kemp, which I understand at the time it was built as a reservoir was probably about the 7th largest inland man-made body of water in the world. It's long been a regional sports and recreation area. Before that, it was the Wichita Breaks that was a haven for cattle rustlers. This is another schematic to give you an idea of the size of the ranch. It's about the size of New York City and Los Angeles combined. It's about 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island. And this is a slide to give you an idea of the outline of the ranch overlaid over the Austin area. Now, I believe that's probably an out-of-date map of Austin. It doesn't quite show all of the growth in the Austin area, but it gives you an idea of the amount of land that's covered by the ranch. After Tom Waggoner's death in 1934, his widow Ella became the sole trustee of the W.T. Waggoner estate. She continued in that role until 1959, when her son E. Paul Waggoner took over. By 1934, all of the Waggoner interests were managed in Vernon, although they still had homes and a presence in Fort Worth and Decatur. Guy and E. Paul Waggoner ran Arlington Downs, that we'll talk about a little bit later. It was built on the farm that W.T. had purchased near Arlington. Robert L. Moore managed the ranch in Vernon, and he was followed as the general manager by R.B. Anderson, who managed the ranch up until he left to be appointed Secretary of the Treasury in the Eisenhower administration. And we'll talk a little bit about the children of W.T. Waggoner. His daughter Electra, was known as Electra I, was born in 1882. She studied.
Oops, Jeff,
Yes.
we missed part of what you said. You froze just for a second.
I'm sorry. Where do you want me to pick up?
With talking about Electra.
Okay. Electra was the daughter of W.T. Waggoner, born in 1882. She studied abroad and was quite the socialite. She married Albert Buckman Horton of the Philadelphia Hortons in 1902. They had met on a tour of the Himalayas after she'd been sent there ostensibly to try to break up a relationship with another man. She came back from the Himalayas in love with Mr. Horton, and she also had a small tattoo, which was pretty scandalous for that day. She spent most of her time in Fort Worth when she wasn't traveling the world, and her father, to help her stay close to home and not move to Philadelphia, gave Mr. and Mrs. Horton the famous Thistle Hill home as residents there in Vernon as a wedding present. She later built a large home on the Zacawista Ranch property, and that home was last occupied by her grandson, A.B. Horton III, and his family. Electra and Horton had 2 sons, but they later divorced. She was married 2 more times, and she died while awaiting surgery in New York City at the age of 43. Albert Horton had been born in Pennsylvania in 1879. After his marriage to Electra, he owned and managed the Fort Worth Auto and Livery Stable. That was the first automobile dealership in Fort Worth, and dealt in Winston and Franklin cars. It was quite the innovation for that time in Fort Worth, as the automobile industry was just getting started. Their wedding gift, Thistle Hill, was completed in 1904 and was a centerpiece for Fort Worth social and charitable activities. Other members of the family and other cattle barons built fine homes nearby along Summit Avenue around to stay close together. In 1910, the Hortons sold Thistle Hill and moved to the Zacawista Ranch. Cattleman and real estate tycoon Winfield Scott spent $90,000 in the purchase of it, and it was later used, I believe, as a children's home and has been restored as an event venue in Fort Worth today. The Hortons were the parents of 2 sons, Tom W. and Albert Horton. The latter was known as Buster. Tom Horton died at the age of 25. He'd been married 8 times, but he had no children by the time he was 25. Guy Waggoner, son of W.T. Waggoner, was born in 1883 in Decatur. He had been married 6 times, including one marriage to Burt Burnett's granddaughter, Ann Valiant Burnett. For a while, it looked like two Texas dynasties, the Waggoner Ranch and the 460s Ranch, were going to be together there. He and his first 2 wives lived in Fort Worth, where he served as a director of the First National Bank after his father's death. Later on, he built a home on the Four Corners section of the ranch. He was, like his father, was especially interested in good horses and good cattle, and especially the horses, and was actively involved with his father and brother in the management and the operation of Arlington Downs. He'd served terms as the racing commissioner both in Texas and in New Mexico. After racing was outlawed in Texas, he moved to New Mexico to manage a ranch there that they owned. And after the closing of Arlington Downs, he pretty much stayed in New Mexico. He did have a home in Vernon, and he died in Fort Worth in 1950. Edward Paul, or E. Paul as he was known, was born in Decatur in 1889. He enjoyed going to the ranch with his father, and he early on developed an interest in ranching, and he too was especially interested in horses. He married Helen Buck, eloping with her after 2 weeks after they'd met, and they stayed married for over 50 years. They were certainly opposites. E. Paul was described as pretty crusty and a little rough around the edges, and Helen was artistic, refined, and well educated. E. Paul worked closely with his father and brother on the Arlington Downs and the 3D stock farm. They had the racetrack there. That's a good thing to leave it there. And when it closed, when the racetrack closed, he found a way to continue his interest in horses and with the development of the Santa Rosa Roundup rodeo. While a lot of the Waggoner family seemed to enjoy lavish parties and touring the world, E. Paul's idea of a good time was a horse race or a rodeo or a whiskey and a poker game. He took over the management of the W.T. Waggoner estate from his mother and continued his oversight of the ranch with his son-in-law John Biggs until Mr. Waggoner's death in 1967. Helen, his wife of 57 years, described him as crusty on the outside with a heart as big as an elephant. He was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, that's now known as the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, and into the American Quarter Horse Association Hall of Fame later in 1991. A big part of the Waggoner family and the Waggoner story is the horses, and starting with the racetrack that was built in 1929. Tom Waggoner had a dream to build a racetrack, and along with his sons, Guy and E. Paul, built a $2 million racetrack located halfway between Dallas and Fort Worth on the 3D stock farm. Now today, that's the Great Southwest Industrial District. Horse racing had been outlawed in Texas since 1909. Tom worked for years to get it legalized and actually worked on some of the legislation that provided for schools and other beneficiaries of the taxes off of racing. That the bill that Tom wrote pretty much was what was adopted by the legislature. The racetrack they built was one of the finest in the country. They had, there were 20 stables that could house 500 visiting horses. They had a huge barn with concrete stalls for the Waggoner 3D horses, a big track, and a clubhouse. The racetrack had a lake in the middle and a polo field that was added, and that was the pride and joy of Tom's grandson, Buster Wharton. Tom often invited Amon Carter, who was founder and president of the Fort Worth Star Telegram and Mr. Fort Worth, and Will Rogers to the races. They got the racing legislation passed in 1934, but sadly, Tom Waggoner never saw a race there. He suffered a stroke and lost his sight and was unable to even go see the races, but he could go out and visit his horses. And he had a particular favorite horse named Cowpuncher that would perk up when Tom Waggoner came around, and that was as good a therapy as he could have after his stroke, to go visit Cowpuncher. but he died in 1934, and racing was outlawed again in a special session of the legislature in 1937. E. Paul Waggoner's interest in horses wasn't limited to the races, and he developed into quite a horseman in his own name. This is a picture of Waggoner, who was called the all-time record quarter horse sire. The English translation of Waggoner means pretty good, and that's kind of an understatement for he was one of the most influential horses in the quarter horse industry from the 1940s through the 1960s. He was born in 1944, and E. Paul bought him for $5,700, shipped him down to the stock farm in Arlington and began showing him. And he won a lot of shows such as the Denver National Western, the Southwestern Exposition and Stock Show at Fort Worth, and began to be developed as a cutting horse and won all kinds of cutting recognition. Pine Johnson trained him and took him to the toughest competitions, and they would consistently win. And then he won the AQHA champion title, and then Mr. Waggoner retired him to his stables, first at Arlington Downs and then later at the Santa Rosa stables in Vernon at his rodeo grounds. Waggoner sired 405 registered foals. Of those, 36 were American Quarter Horse Association champions, and 3 are in the National Cutting Horse Association's Hall of Fame. When Arlington Downs closed, E. Paul had that special barn in the earlier picture built for him at the Santa Rosa Roundup grounds south of Vernon. He died in 1969, and according to E. Paul Waggoner's wishes, was buried standing up across the road from the main entrance to the ranch south of Vernon with a 4-ton granite marker that's pictured here that marks his grave. As I said earlier, Mr. Waggoner was inducted into the American Quarter Horse Association Hall of Fame, and Waggoner was also inducted into the Horse Hall of Fame in 1990. E. Paul had moved from racing to rodeo when horse racing was ended in Texas, and had started developing a rodeo program south of Vernon. It was sort of put on hold and interrupted by World War II, but by 1946, he had his rodeo vision pretty much underway. He took the grandstands from Arlington Downs. He took an old hangar from the Victory Field Army Air Corps training facility south of Vernon, and moved the old parsonage from the Methodist Church out to a 90-acre tract south of Vernon, and established the Santa Rosa Roundup and Livestock Exhibition grounds out there. And in 1946, began hosting rodeos and horse shows out there. He spared no expense in bringing the best in rodeo to Vernon. E. Paul Waggoner served as president of the rodeo, and his son-in-law John Biggs was the general manager. They concentrated on bringing the finest rodeo stock from the Butler Brothers and Rodeo Company, and later on the Butler and Son Rodeo Company, and the best cowboys in professional rodeo over the last 75 years have at one time or another performed in this rodeo arena. In 1949, some men in Vernon decided that they wanted to help support Mr. Waggoner's Santa Rosa Roundup with a riding club that could visit other rodeos to advertise the Santa Rosa Roundup. 16 men, including E. Paul Waggoner's son-in-law John Biggs, formed the Santa Rosa Palomino Club, and Mr. Biggs was, as I said, a charter member and served as the club's president for the first 3 years that the club got off the ground. The club developed precision drills that won the National Drill Team Championship each of the 2 times it entered. After Mr. Waggoner died, Mr. Biggs produced the rodeo for a few years and then handed it over to the people of Vernon to continue the rodeo, and the Palomino Club continued the rodeo for a number of years until it was handed off to a rodeo association. During that time, the Palomino Club never stopped promoting the rodeo all over the country, and appeared in Tournament of Roses parade and rodeos from Tucson, Arizona to Birmingham, Alabama, and as far north as Cody, Wyoming. Mr. Biggs had remained a member and a supporter of the club for many years, even after he discontinued riding with the club. This group's been named the Texas Ambassadors on Horseback for the Texas Legislature and inducted into the Texas Rodeo Hall of Fame. The rodeo continues to be a premier annual event in Vernon, bringing rodeo fans from all over the region, and have had stars such as Rex Allen, Ken Curtis, Michael Landon, Tanya Tucker, Vernon Husky, and others to perform in the arena. As I said, Mr. Biggs continued the rodeo after Mr. Waggoner's death before handing it over to the people of Vernon. The grounds out there now belong to the Santa Rosa Roundup Association, and after purchasing with donations from people in the community. E. Paul and Helen Waggoner had one daughter, Electra Waggoner. She was called Electra too, out of deference to her aunt. She became an international celebrity in her own right. She was a sculptor of some renown. She was born in Fort Worth, but lived most of her life on the ranch. She was so famous that her brother-in-law, the president of General Motors Buick Division, named the Buick Electra after her. The Lockheed Electra was also named after Mrs. Biggs. Electra was born in 1912, and as an only child, she was 2 when her father moved the family from Fort Worth to the ranch. And for several years, she lived there and enjoyed a ranch childhood. She reported being lonely and without not having very many playmates, but she recalled she and her family following the chuck wagon for beef and beans, sometimes sleeping under the stars, and would ride to Vernon in the buckboard for supplies, or was later a passenger in an open bucket seat on the running board of her father's roadster. In 1918, E. Paul moved the family back to Fort Worth, and Electra enjoyed the benefits of an upscale childhood. She went to private school and lessons in music and dance. One of the private schools was held in her own backyard that her mother organized, and one of her classmates in the private school was Mary Martin, later on of Broadway fame as Peter Pan, and the mother of Larry Hagman. As a teen, she was sent to boarding school and then went to Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. And after a brief stint back in Fort Worth, she moved to New York City. While she was in New York, her sculpting career blossomed. The Amon Carter, the head of Fort Worth Star Telegram, commissioned her to do a bust of Vice President John Nance Garner for the Texas Centennial, which she said was quite a challenge because he never would pose for her. He would never look up from behind his newspaper, so she had to finish the sculpture just from photographs. One newspaper column called her the Doris Duke of Texas, and because she insisted that her art wasn't just an escape from being a poor little rich girl syndrome, but she wanted to pursue it as a livelihood. She had a number of commissions, including Coach Newt Rockney of Notre Dame, Frank Phillips of Phillips Petroleum Company, panels commissioned by various people on the history of lighting, commissioned by Consolidated Edison, and a bust of actor Victor McLaglen, and pictured here a bust of Harry Truman. They had a little bit of adventure getting this bust into the White House for President Truman to inspect it and give his approval, as she and Mr. Biggs were carrying the bust in a box into the White House, and a Secret Service agent asked John Biggs what he had in the box, and he said, "I've got the president's head." So they had to stop and frisk him and open it up and see what was going on with that. Later on, she worked hard to capture a bust of her, or in clay, it was the head of her maid, an African-American, Native American woman. and she had studied marble cutting, and she did this bust of this maid called Enigma, and she entered it in several European competitions where she won third place and started developing a real reputation as a sculptor. She had a major exhibition in New York City with 31 pieces, and actually sold Enigma for $3,000. She did several portrait medallions, including her cousin Buster and his wife and others. In 1936, she was commissioned by Amon Carter to do what was probably her most famous sculpture, the one pictured in this and in the next slide. That's a life-size rendition of Will Rogers on his horse Soapsuds. Rogers had been a close friend of both Amon Carter and W.T. Waggoner, and he was a frequent visitor at both Arlington Downs and the ranch. Electra started a 10-inch clay model working with Rogers' son in California. This was, of course, after Will Rogers had been killed in the plane crash in 1935. There were several delays because of the bronze shortage, and they actually had to hide this sculpture for a while to keep it from being confiscated for the war effort. But they completed this, and it was dedicated in 1947 in front of the Will Rogers Memorial Coliseum in Fort Worth. General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, unveiled the statue with Margaret Truman saying "Home on the Range." It was a pretty big celebration for the family and for the city of Fort Worth. And later, folks from Texas Tech will recognize that, as there's a copy of it on the Texas Tech campus, and there's one at Claremore, Oklahoma, and one at the Anatole Hotel in Dallas. There's not really a catalog of Electra Waggoner Biggs's work. The best overview is right here in the museum. The picture on the left that you might have seen in the earlier video is a replica of Electra Waggoner Biggs's studio that she had out at the ranch. And it has here at the museum, we have a collection of sculpture, photographs, and a lot of other things related to her career as a sculptress, along with the history of the ranch. She never really publicized or promoted her sculptures, and never really hired an agent. The commissions that came to her came by word of mouth and by her reputation. She lived out her life on the ranch, and she died in the hospital in Vernon in April of 2001 after a lengthy illness. And she's buried in Sherman. Electra Waggoner socialized with people named Rockefeller, Bouvier, Chrysler, and others, and moved in international circles. And she had a lot of beaux and was married briefly early in her life to a marriage that didn't work out for her. And when John Biggs came along, he was special. He was the love of her life. He had gone to the Virginia Military Institute and had a choice of going into business for the International Paper Company or playing for baseball for the Giants, and chose business and rose to be, I believe, president of the International Paper Company. He had been in the Army in intelligence and the Quartermaster Corps during World War II. And he and Electra Waggoner got married in April of 1943. And that was the start of a lifelong love affair between these two. They had two daughters, Electra the third and Helen. And in 1946, after the war, the Biggs family moved back to the Waggoner Ranch south of Vernon and made their home there. Mr. Biggs was named assistant manager of the ranch and the general manager of the Santa Rosa Roundup. And then in 1953, he took over as general manager of the W.T. Waggoner estate. And it was actually a good time for him to take over. There was a cash flow problem at the time due to the construction of a pretty elaborate W.T. Waggoner estate headquarters building in Vernon and some other issues. And so it took him a while to get the ranch back on a good cash management basis. And they'd purchased some aircraft as well. Independent of the ranch, Mr. Biggs had a significant impact on the cattle industry in Texas. He had served 2 terms as president of the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. And he served at a time when the cattlemen of North Texas and the cattlemen of South Texas weren't getting along because of their differences in approach to raising cattle. And he was somehow able to bridge that gap and bring them together where they could work for their common interests of the cattle industry as a whole. But he stayed true to Hereford cattle up until he started introducing some crossbreeds into it. He, funny story that was told about him, one of Electra's old boyfriends, Winthrop Rockefeller, invited them to an auction at his cattle farm in Arkansas. And the Biggs went, but Mr. Biggs told her, said, "Now, Electra, you sit on your hands, don't buy any of these cattle." They were selling Santa Gertrudis cattle that had been bred on the King Ranch, and just a different kind of cattle than what he was used to. He said, don't buy any of these. They're not our kind of cattle. Well, she didn't buy one, but lo and behold, a few weeks later, a Santa Gertrudis bull arrived at the ranch that was a gift of the Kleberg family from the King Ranch. Electra never did really know what happened to him. The bull didn't get turned out with the cows. No one really knows for sure what happened to him, but he didn't breed any Waggoner cattle. He also served a term on the Board of Regents of Texas A&M University and was chairman of the Waggoner National Bank in Vernon and several other banks. And he ran the W.T. Waggoner estate and had been involved in the Santa Rosa Roundup until 1970 and ran the ranch until his death in 1975. There'd been a change in ownership of the ranch back in 1953. After Guy Waggoner died, his son sold his 1/3 interest in the ranch to the W.T. Waggoner estate. He kept his oil and mineral rights, but left E. Paul Waggoner and Buster Wharton as the owners of the estate. Now, this map that on here shows a little bit about how the ranch is divided up into different sections. It's obviously a large area to cover. The ranch is divided into line camps that would have families that would live out there and look at with a string of horses and look after a certain section of the ranch, in addition to cowboys that lived in the photograph on the left, a bunkhouse, and had a cook shack there at the quadrangle at the ranch headquarters. And then near the ranch headquarters along the highway to Seymour, Texas, is what's known as Cowboy Road. It's a row of houses for some of the married cowboys that work on the ranch. Buster Wharton was the son of Electra Waggoner Wharton, and he lived for a time in his mother Electra One's house at the Zacawista Ranch. He had entertained pretty lavishly himself and was well known as an outstanding polo player. He played at the polo fields that his grandfather built at Arlington Downs and had a polo field built there near his Zacawista home. He was married 4 times. He had a son, A.B. Wharton III, and adopted the daughter of one of his wives. His son lived with his mother, Buster's first wife, in New Mexico. Buster died in 1963. Buster Wharton, before he had died, had filed a friendly lawsuit to have his share of the estate purchased by the Waggoner estate, which would have left E. Paul Waggoner as the sole owner of the ranch, but he died before that lawsuit could be concluded, which led to about a 7-year dispute over the ownership of the ranch. When Buster Wharton died, a number of people filed claims as the rightful heirs, and it worked its way through the courts, so that by, I believe, about 1967, ownership of the Waggoner estate was divided between Electra Waggoner Biggs, the surviving daughter of E. Paul Waggoner, and A.B. Wharton III, who was known as Bucky. Bucky had been in the Army when he was designated as heir to the ranch, and he moved to the ranch shortly after that. He first moved into the guest house of his family's Zacawista home. He married Jolene Meter and moved into and remodeled his grandmother's Zacawista home. He completed a business degree at Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, and then he dove into learning all aspects of the ranch management and the business of the W.T. Waggoner estate, and became pretty well known for his interest in management and banking in Vernon and other cities. He and Jolene had 2 children, and they were involved in the operation of the ranch. And after the death of John Biggs in 1975, the ranch was overseen by a series of managers. Later, the operation of the estate was handled by Bucky Horton and Gene Willingham, who was the husband of Helen Willingham, the daughter of Electra Waggoner Biggs. The Willingham family lived at the Santa Rosa Ranch near her mother. Helen has been involved in a number of charitable activities in Vernon, especially the Red River Valley Museum and the Boys and Girls Club of Vernon. Jolene Horton was also a director of the museum at one time on the board of directors. And this co-directorship guided the estate up to its conclusion. Moving away from some of the family history, the heart of any ranching operation is the workforce that makes it go. The Waggoner Ranch has been legendary for some of its working cowboys. Now, cowboys have been romanticized in myth and legend, Hollywood and literature, but it's work. It's emphasis on working and working cowboy. For most of these fellows, being a cowboy is not just an occupation, it's a way of life. They're practicing the same skills, attitudes, things that drove the cowboys of the 19th century, and you can see those in the work of cowboys today. It's often a dangerous job in all kinds of weather, taking care of the cattle and their needs for health and feed and welfare and water. We've heard some of them say that sometimes the more dangerous an activity is, the more likely you are. Many of the cowboys on the Waggoner Ranch have been 2nd and 3rd generation members of the same family. They viewed them. We're getting a message that says the internet connection is unstable. Are y'all still with us?
I'm still with you. We did miss the sentence where you were saying something about it's dangerous.
Okay. Well, there's some of them laugh that it seems like the more dangerous an activity is, sometimes the more the cowboys will laugh about it and just dive into it. And many of these fellows are 2nd and 3rd generation members, employees of the ranch. They view it less as being employees of a corporation and more like being part of a large family. For many of them, working on the Waggoner Ranch or the other big ranches, that's the only life they've ever known. A number of legendary cowboys like Pine Johnson, Bill Neal brothers, and others have lives on these ranches. We'll talk about a few. A couple of old time fellas. There was an old cowboy named Jimmy Roberts that was hired back in the early days, back when they were still fighting rustlers. He showed up with 2 pistols, a rifle, and a shotgun, and apparently could cuss a blue streak. And his job was to eliminate the rustlers that would range between the Wichita Breaks and Greer County and old Oklahoma. Somebody asked him why he cussed so much, and he said, well, people were cussing me a lot, and I found if I'd cuss them back, I had to shoot fewer of them. He kept the rustling to a minimum. Was a black cowboy around the turn of the 19th century named Nels Eder, who was probably one of the best cowboys anybody of that era had ever seen. He was strong as an ox and weighed about 200 pounds and would fight anybody, and apparently had some brushes with the law. He never went to sleep without his horse tied next to him, saddled up, in case he had to make a quick getaway. One time they were gathering cattle over in the Big Pasture in the Indian Territory, and C.T. Herring, who was another rancher and banker in this area, got struck by lightning, blew a blue streak down his back and split his boot and knocked him off his horse. And they had to send for a doctor, and Nels Eder was the only one who was willing to go, because The Red River was swollen and raging, and everybody else was afraid to try to cross it, and the nearest doctor was at Doan's store. Nels said he'd go if Tom Waggoner would let him ride his best horse. So he went to Doan's, fetched the doctor, brought him back. They nursed Mr. Herring back to where he could at least get back home. And then he was to take the doctor back. For all of that, Mr. Herring gave him a tip of $5. And since he was a pretty well-to-do banker, the rancher there felt like that was a little bit of a light payment for risking his life crossing the river. Nels said, "Don't worry about it. I'll get it back. I'll eat enough of Mr. Herring's cattle over the years to make up the difference." Okay. One of the legendary cowboys of the modern era was Tony Hazelwood. He was a longtime foreman of the ranch and had been described as an old-time cowman and he had a special kinship with E. Paul Waggoner. He was a no-nonsense kind of fella. Story is told that when they had radios in the cars, he would leave it turned off, turn it on and say something to one of the hands and then turn the radio back off. And whoever was riding with him, a guest, said, "Why don't you leave the radio on?" And he said, Tony said, "Well, that radio's for me to call them. It's not for them to call me." He had one pet peeve. He didn't believe that a man should be asked how many cattle he had or how many acres of land he had, whether they were his own cattle or cattle he was taking care of for somebody else. He had somebody visiting the ranch one time that was questioning him pretty hard about how many cattle were on the Waggoner spread. And he hem-hawed around and finally said, "We don't have as many as we had last year, but we'll probably have more next year." And that was the end of it. He was honored at the Santa Rosa Roundup in the 60s, and he was a subject of a bust by Electra Waggoner Biggs that we have here in the museum. When he died in 1965, they honored him by closing the bullpen in the quadrangle at the headquarters and buried him in the middle of it.
Jeff, you froze again right at the end of your talk about Hazelwood. Sorry, folks, we're just having a little bit of connection issue. Just bear with us one moment. Well, while we're waiting for Jeff to come back on, any questions that you might have for Jeff, we would love to have them in the chat. Looks like they're going to do a reboot, come back in. And then that way we can ask Mr. Bearden and all of his infinite knowledge about Waggoner Ranch to answer some of our questions here. Hopefully he'll pop. Okay, they are coming back on, they say, so just bear with us one moment. Such is the life with virtual events. These things just happen. Here we go. Almost there. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, are we back in business yet?
Just
We are. Okay. Glad to see you again, Jeff. We're getting lots of good comments in the chat, so we're excited to see the end of your presentation.
Okay. Well, talking a little bit about GL, I was privileged to know him growing up. His family and my family were friends, and from about the age of 12, he would arrange for us to go and watch the spring and fall roundups and eat at the chuck wagon, and in January sit on the fence at Whiteface and watch the cowboys break their string of horses. But he was a wealth of information about the ranch, but the hard part was to get him to talk. When the Palomino Club invited a visiting riding club to perform at the Santa Rosa Roundup, and we arranged a tour of the ranch, and GL was supposed to ride on the bus and narrate the tour. So at the start of it, he just stood up and said, "I don't have much to say, but if y'all got questions, I'll be happy to answer." And that was the tour. He retired from the ranch, moved to town, and like Tony Hazelwood, the stories are legendary among the men who worked for him. Now, the ranch has always been grounded in traditional cattle handling by cowboys, but the Waggoners also had a number of innovations. They had already established their business operations in the modern W.T. Waggoner estate building in Vernon in the early 50s and had acquired aircraft just so they could get around to see about their various interests in Fort Worth, New Mexico, and Vernon. And they were one of the first ones to herd cattle with a helicopter. They thought they would try that because they have pretty extensive rangelands, obviously, and some of it's pretty rough, even hard to get to on horseback. They purchased a helicopter from Bell Helicopter, and they had a pilot that knew how to fly it, but then they also hired a fellow named Gil Eggleston away from Bell Helicopter to come and take care of aircraft maintenance. They used to say that probably some of the old time cowboys might have turned over in their grave to see the helicopter out there, but Tony Hazelwood said the helicopter was probably equivalent to about 15 to 20 cowboys when it came to gathering the cattle every spring. Will Rogers would have loved it had he seen it because he was such a fan of aviation. John Biggs said that a ranch can't get along without good horses and good cowboys to ride them. But with 20,000 Hereford cattle scattered over 500,000 acres, the helicopter sure makes the job easier. The use of the helicopter was the subject of a documentary that had its premiere in Vernon. That's the picture there in downtown Vernon. In 2003, the terms of the trust that governed the W.T. Waggoner estate expired, and the family members elected to end the trust. After years of negotiation, the ranch was sold in 2016 to Stan Kroenke. He's a businessman that he's probably best known as the owner of the Los Angeles Rams. Today, the ranch still has around 12,000, 13,000 mother cows. They've still got the big field. It's broken up a little more, but they still have to do some of the same operations as done before. They have added a wildlife and a hunting program, but the ranch is still together under one fence. The sale of the ranch was the end of an era for one family, but wasn't for the ranch. It continues today. It's under new ownership. But while some of the things about the ranch have changed, as is inevitable, some things have remained the same. Cowboys, horses, cattle, oil wells, and a great big piece of Texas all under one fence. The museum here at Vernon is currently in the final phases of design for an updated Waggoner room that tells the story of the ranch in a much more sophisticated fashion, with interactive displays and more detailed discussion of the history and impact of the ranch. And we continue to accept donations, and we appreciate them. This is the centerpiece of the Waggoner room now, and will remain the centerpiece in the redesign. This is a mural about the history of the ranch. Martinez, that's we're sitting in front of it here now, and it will be include a theater and displays, and we're eager to get this underway. So you all come see us. We've got some books available. I think there will be links to these, links directly to the publishers on the Wyman Minzer book and the Cowboys of the Waggoner Ranch book. You can order the Electra 2 book from the museum. And that is a fast trip through the Waggoner Ranch history. Come see us if you get a chance, and we'll be happy to answer questions if we haven't worn you out at this point.
Not worn out at all, but there were so many kind comments in the chat about this being a very special event and you being a really good storyteller. And I know it's hard to present when you can't hear people laughing at the funny bits, but I know I was for sure chuckling, and I'm sure our audience was too. Thank you for that presentation. It was incredible. And I'm always humbled and surprised when I hear the story of a ranch and just how impactful it is on so many lives, not just the landowner, but the families and the communities around and all of the people who work and are involved. And that's really the story of the ranch, is the story of all of the people. And you presented that so well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. One is from Dawn. Dawn, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or shall I just go for it? Well, I will ask it for him. So he was curious, was Wharton the founder of the Wharton School of Finance?
I believe that the A.B. Wharton that married Electra Waggoner was of that family. I don't know all of those relations. That was diving into that was a little bit outside the scope of this presentation. But I believe that to be the case, that they were, that was the Wharton family that was related to the Wharton School in Pennsylvania. And again, there was a strong possibility that A.B. Wharton and Electra would move to Pennsylvania. And so W.T. Waggoner built Thistle Hill to help sweeten the deal for them to stay in Texas, stay in Fort Worth.
I just unmuted, and thanks for that. I appreciate that information.
Thanks, Don. I hope I didn't jump in front of you there.
No, you didn't. I just couldn't.
Okay.
I couldn't get to the button fast enough.
It's hard, isn't it?
Thanks again.
Thank you for the
Appreciate
question.
the presentation. Was fabulous. We spent a lot of time Wichita Falls to Abilene, lived in Abilene, and been trekking around the ranch for many, many years. And you did a phenomenal job. Can't wait to come and see the museum.
Well, we'll be glad to have you come.
David Mura, did you want to unmute and ask your question? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. David, Murrah, do you want to ask your question? Well, I'll ask it for him. He can always jump in and if he comes off mute, but he's asking, Jeff, did you go to Hardin Simmons?
Did I go to Hardin Simmons?
Mm-hmm. That's the
No.
question.
No, I went to Texas A&M and then later to the University of Texas at Arlington.
Yeah, I think in your bio, when we were doing the bio, we mentioned the schools that you had. You've been involved in quite a few career aspirations, so it's interesting to hear the story. Okay, another question is, Susan Blackman is asking about the slides. Susan, do you want to pop on and ask your other question? Or talk to Jeff? We might be able to get some of these slides to share with folks. So Cooper, maybe I'll reach out to you after the presentation and see what we can do. We are going to send a link to everyone on the chat tonight to view the presentation again. So you'll have that for sure. And if we can get a hold of some of the slides, we will include those in our email. So hope to do that. Susan was also saying that her late husband worked for E. Paul as a teenager. So it sounds like she has a family connection. So, okay. Then we have a question about, where is the story about Nels Etter written? Can you give us a book or a manuscript reference, please?
I found that story in a book called Thistle Hill that was published about, it was centered around the house in Fort Worth. And I hope people are familiar with that. It's a pretty well-known site in Fort Worth. And the book starts off by telling the story of the Waggoner family and then later it tells the story of the Scott family that owned the home after the Whartons sold it. And I believe I got that story from the Thistle Hill book.
Thank you, Jeff. And if we do find a link to that, I'll try to include that in the email if you can remember.
What? Yeah, we can sell one here. We can sell a copy of the book through the museum gift shop here.
Oh, there you go. And in a moment, I will once again paste the links to the museum and the books that were the books that were recommended. So I will
Another
do that.
interesting story about Nels Etter. He, as I said, he occasionally had brushes with the law, and during one escape, he dove into a hog pen, and when he came up, the peace officer blew his left arm off. That made it kind of hard because he was a left-handed cowboy, but he learned to rope with his right hand, and apparently was just as effective a cowboy with his right hand as he was with his left hand.
The stories about the individuals are the very best part of this presentation for me. It's like listening to folks that were in the community that I grew up around on a ranch, similar stories. Okay, we have a question from Cheryl. Is Quanah Parker buried on the ranch? And Cheryl, if you want to unmute and converse about that, feel free.
No, Quanah Parker is buried, I believe, at Fort Sill. He was a frequent visitor at the ranch, was a frequent visitor at Doan's Crossing. He had a home in Cache, or near Cache, Oklahoma, that actually W.T. Waggoner and Burt Burnett and others built for him, called the Star House. And I know there are efforts underway to try to preserve that now. Quanah asked to have the stars put on top of it, to sort of as a symbol of his leadership, kind of looking at an equivalent like a five-star general. He and another Chief Yellow Bear were frequent guests of the Waggoners and the Burnetts in Fort Worth. And one night they were in a hotel after gas lighting was installed in there, and they blew out the gas lights, not knowing they needed to turn the gas off. And then the next morning, Yellow Bear was dead, and Quanah Parker was near death. He happened to have his window open, but they were able to revive Quanah and get him back to Oklahoma, and were able to dodge some pretty serious difficulties with the Comanche Nation over nearly killing a couple of them as guests in a Fort Worth hotel room.
Very interesting. Thank you.
But
Thank you, Cheryl.
I'm sorry, he's buried, I believe, at Fort Sill, and they moved the remains of his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker. You know, the story of Cynthia Ann, who had been captured as a child and raised by the Comanches and was Quanah's mother. And she was recaptured about 30 miles from here at the Pease River Massacre in 1860. And Quanah escaped as a child and rose to become the last war chief of the Comanches and the Quahati band of the Comanche Nation.
Was that one incident with the cornfield the only uprising the Indians had against the Waggoners?
No, there were a number of them. That was one that stood out because it happened when they were so young. And Cicely Ann, after Dan's first wife, Tom's mother, died, shortly Dan remarried, or a few years married Cicely Ann Halsell, and but he was gone a lot, and that one stuck out because they remembered it, and that story was passed down in the family as well as being documented in some of the books. Because they could hear their dog being killed, they could hear a horse being killed from out in the cornfield, and just hid there overnight. And that was not uncommon. That same thing happened to the Doan's family near here, and it just happened from time to time before peace was made. But that was the principal one that was documented. Actually, after about 1874, there were very few problems with Indians in Northwest Texas as far as fighting. There was the occasional sortie or stealing, but the biggest problem was rustling. Rustling, there was where the Lake Kemp is now was known as the Wichita Breaks. That was a haven for rustlers, and they would circle around Vernon up to Greer County, which is in Oklahoma now, but was disputed territory there. And that was the reason for the founding of the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, I believe about 1877 in Graham, to try to get a handle on rustling. And they developed stock detectives that have evolved into today's special rangers, because we still have cattle rustling in the 21st century, but not on the scale that was happening in the late 19th century.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. So I have a question from Andrea about the Enigma sculpture. Are there any pictures of it? She says she found a mention of it online, but couldn't find any pics.
Can we bring it over here? Which is easy.
taking with us.
Oh, okay.
Sorry for the choppiness.
That's okay. We're with you. Oh, that's
This is
beautiful.
The Enigma sculpture. This is in the portion of the museum that's the replica of the studio that was at the Santa Rosa Ranch.
There you go, Andrea. Oh, I'm glad you asked that question, or we wouldn't have gotten that little tour of that gallery. Incredible. Any other questions for Jeff this evening? Okay, well, this has been truly
Jeff, I have a question for you.
Oh,
This
there we
is
go.
Joe Kilquist. Did you in your research find, did the Wagners do any business with Charles Goodnight, or did they have a business relationship?
In all honesty, I didn't come across a lot of information about that. That's not to say that they didn't. It's just that I don't know. Charles Goodnight had moved his, and I believe had moved his operations up to the Panhandle with John Adair, and had the J.A. Ranch a little bit, maybe a little bit earlier. I hate to say a whole lot about it because I might be giving you the wrong information, but I would not be surprised. A lot of those contemporary cattlemen did know each other. Goodnight was maybe a little bit earlier than W.T. Waggoner. He's certainly contemporary of Dan Waggoner. So I would not be surprised if they weren't acquainted or possibly did some business, but I didn't come across that. If I did, it didn't register with me to include it in the presentation, but interesting question that I may want to go back and look into it.
Well, I tried to look into it in the book titled Charles Goodnight. I only found one page that mentioned the Wagoners, and all it said about the Wagoners is they did not, that the ladies Wagoners didn't like to eat their own cattle. And that
Didn't
was
like to
it.
eat their own cattle.
Yeah, right. So, but that was it. And I was surprised that they were so contemporaneous almost at the same time.
Mhm.
And they weren't that far apart as far as territory goes. And I'm just surprised that there's no mention of them.
Well, I think it bears looking into. Thanks for raising that.
Well, thank you for answering.
Mhm.
I look forward to meeting you, by the way. I'm coming up there.
Well, good.
Thank you so much. Any last minute questions or comments for Jeff? Well, Jeff, I can tell you in the chat, there is just so many thank yous and so much gratitude and appreciation for your
Well,
presentation.
Appreciate the opportunity to do this. It's been a kind of a labor of love and interesting for us, and this is going to help us with our Waggoner Room development, and we appreciate what THC and the Friends of the THC do. And again, my thanks to you all for doing it, and thanks to Cooper for helping pull together the technical parts of some of this, and to Sherry with the museum, and Ann Huskinson, our former museum director, that helped with some material she had, and some family stories that were confirmed by Helen Willingham Farmy. And it's been a pleasure, and we're proud of the Waggoner legacy here in Vernon.
It's great. And I truly hope I can get up there to see that museum too, and to meet you and say hello. And
Please
I really
do.
would love to see the sculptures. That they look incredible. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We're always just, humbled to see the amount of people that are willing to join us for these events, and really hoping that you'll join us for future ones as well. Our next event is on October 6th, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and we'll be having more events after that. Coming up in November, we're hoping to have some special speakers who I can't say just yet because we haven't quite got them lined up, but it's going to be fun. So keep an eye on our website. And then in December, we also hoping to have some foodways presentations and some things that are more celebratory. Oh, we have a hand up. Janice, do you want to pop on and say something or ask a question?
Boy.
Okay, maybe not. Maybe that was just an accident. Okay, so hope to see you all again, and thank you so much for being with us here tonight. And we will follow up with an email with some links and hopefully maybe some of the slides here that Jeff presented tonight, and a copy of the recording, and anything else we can think of, we will put it in that email and send it to you. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Night.
Bye.